Hear us okay? Okay, so we, like Maria mentioned, we are from the Asian Pacific Development Center. I'm the first person speaking. I am Zonya Dawson. I'm a victim advocate coordinator with APDC. I've been with APDC for almost 2 years. And in my role, I do a lot of training and outreach and doing these kinds of presentations.
Hi, I'm Nhu-Min, and I am the director for the Victim Assistance Department. Been with APDC for 3 years now, and we oftentimes do multiple presentations. Usually we like to do it in person just because we know how awkward webinars could be, but this is a great platform to reach everyone around the state, and so we're hoping to just get the message out there.
Yeah. So before we get started on the webinar, I just want to do a really quick overview of who the Asian Pacific Development Center is. We've been around for 39 years, and we originally started as a mental health provider for newly arrived refugees from Southeast Asia. However, in the last 39 years, there's definitely been a shift in the needs of the community and the country of origins that individuals are coming from. So now we have 7 different departments, as you can see there on the screen. Victims Assistance is one of them, and that's the department we represent today. But we are located in Aurora. However, most of our services are statewide. And of course, we'll have our contact information at the end. So if anybody wants to reach out for services or on behalf of a client, you're more than welcome to as well. Okay, so the objective for the webinar today is we will explore the concept of culture, what it means to be culturally and linguistically inclusive, and then we'll examine specific issues that are specific to immigrant and refugee survivors of crime. We have broken down the webinar into 4 chunks today. So the first part, we will talk about understanding that culture needs to be understood in all of its complexities. In our second portion, we will talk about the importance of being aware of your own biases and prejudices. On our third part, we will become more aware of the challenges that immigrant and refugee survivors of crime face. And then in our last chunk, we will try to understand and explore the concept of language justice.
So with everything that we're learning today, this is just based on our experience and how we have kind of explored a lot of these topics through our own communities that we serve in the metro area. If you have different experience, or if you've had cases or instances where that didn't align, or you weren't sure how to interact, please feel free to, ask those questions or tell us more about it so we can explore about that specific situation, because everything is different depending on where you're from, depending on if you're in the rural area versus the metro area, depending on the immigrant and refugee communities that you serve or that you've encountered. And maybe you've never encountered refugee or immigrant community. But again, we want this to be an attempted dialogue with you guys too, so that we can kind of learn from each other.
Okay, so we're gonna dive right into the first part of the presentation today, and that's to understand the culture needs to be understood in all of its complexities. So culture is defined as a set of values, structures, and practices held in common by a group of people who usually identify by ancestry, language, and traditions. Some theories have associated culture with norms, values, traditions that are passed on from generation to generation. Culture has also come to be associated with ethnicity, race, in order to explain the differences between groups of people. So when we talk about culture, we're talking about cultural identity. This refers to the way in which a person defines themselves based on the unique sets of experiences. It's really important to remember that cultural identity can be contradictory, multifaceted, and often changing. The norms and values of a particular group are expressed or thought about in different ways, depending upon the socioeconomic position, their immigration status, sexual orientation, or any number of other axes. Norms and values may also differ for individuals within the same group. So So when we speak about identities, these are a couple different identities we're going to be talking about today. So identities overlap and occur simultaneously. Power does not rest on a single access or on a single identity. So the first identity we're going to explore is ethnicity. So this can be single race, biracial, multiracial, all the above. The second identity that we're going to explore is demographic or identity markers. These are things like gender, sex, age, disability, sexual orientation, languages spoken, religion, and marital status. The third identity, the third part of identity is geographical location. So rural, urban, suburban, lower income neighborhoods, living on a military base, those can all become a part of someone's identity. There's also social location and history. So levels of education, their class position, mobility, immigration status, employment status. The next thing is the political history. And these are things like colonialism, imperialism, civil or international wars, racial segregation, dictatorships, capitalism. Those can all form someone's identity. And then the next part of identity is their practices. So these are things like food, music, holidays, styles of dress, and celebrations.
So with all these different identities, as you can see, many of them can overlap and many of them can change. And with us specifically working at APDC, we've seen that with our own clients where they may have came from a refugee camp in Thailand, but they're not Thai, that they're actually Burmese. And then there are people who may speak Burmese, but would identify as, would actually be from Burma, but would be Karen versus the other way around. And oftentimes when we look at the maps and whatnot, you assume, oh, you're from this country, therefore you must speak this language. And so that's already that preconceived notion that one would have. And so with all of this, especially with the social and location, the social location and history, that changes constantly. And we know right now with a lot of countries, there's a lot of conflict that's occurring. And so when we have asylee, refugees, and immigrants coming here, it's good for us as service providers to take a step back and allow them to identify themselves versus us classifying them.
Yeah, and individuals also might identify more strongly than one culture or another. They might also experience several identities at the same time. And as Nhu-Min mentioned, it can shift between, individuals can shift between different cultural identities. So we can't talk about culture and cultural identity without bringing up the cultural iceberg. So this picture here is used a lot to talk about so the 10% on the top is the surface culture, right? Like an iceberg, sometimes when we interact with others, we only see that 10% on top. We see things like food, festivals, holidays, languages, music. However, a part of someone's identity and their culture usually is in that 90% that we cannot see, okay? And that's things like communication styles, so eye contact, facial expressions, personal space is a big one. Their ideas or concepts of time, of fairness, of roles, right, in regards to age, class, family. Their notions of manners, of friendship, of modesty or cleanliness, and their attitudes towards work, towards authority, approaches to religion, marriage, child rearing, things like that. So those are things that are not easily, that can easily be seen when we're just speaking with somebody, or as service providers, if we're spending an hour maybe in an intake with a survivor, we might not be getting to that deep culture.
And so with all of this, intersectionality is what we constantly go back to. And intersectionality, we see that in the work that we do, but we also see that in the survivors of crime. Because to be honest, we are working with people, with humans. And so everyone has different dimension and different layers, barriers, and challenges. For us to be service provider and only work in silo or only address that one aspect of their, only the victimization or only that one thing they need, kind of diminish that humanity in them. And so we oftentimes try to view the client or the survivor as a whole. What else can we do in a holistic way to really address all these issues? And maybe your service, or as a service provider, you can't do everything, but that's where the collaboration and partnerships are so important. And we know in this work, intersectionality with parallel movements are really apparent, but how do we open that dialogue and be resources for each other? And that in itself is its own culture in the work that we do, but now to really use that understanding of intersectionality and how that becomes its own web to help clients. And it may take time, and that's the thing, like to work with various people with different issues, with different barriers, we have to understand that it's going to take a lot of time and it's going to take a lot of patience on our end to really understand that aspect or the intersectionality of their crime and their needs, and to be respectful of that. Oftentimes, the clients that we see, we may not have a large number of cases, but the hours that we spend with our clients to really dive into different concepts, to really dive into accessibility of resources that would fit their needs, that we would really talk about what else is happening beyond just, you know, that crime that may have occurred of them, and to really address the trauma that is underlining more than just that one victimization or the one reason they're coming in. And oftentimes we feel like with the refugee and immigrant communities, they don't have that space to be able to really sit down and discuss what is going on and how can they communicate this effectively to someone who would listen. And that's why we strive and really taking our time with our client and discovering and understanding who they are and being part of that support system.
Yeah, and by taking into account, right, someone's historical, social, or political history, we can really provide great services and make sure the services are unique to every individual's specific needs. Of course, you know, like our objective states, we're trying to understand that culture has all these complexities. There's really no way that we're going to accomplish that over an hour webinar or even, you know, a day-long training. So we really are just giving y'all a little taster, and then definitely something to think about, and you can always reach out to us if you want to learn more about maybe specific cultures or specific needs that come with the immigrant and refugee community. So with that being said, we're going to move forward to our second objective for the day, and that's to understand the importance of being aware of your own biases and prejudices. So I'm sure a lot of you who are on this call or have worked in this field have seen the term or heard the term cultural competence. I'm sure a lot of us have gone to cultural competency trainings. So for Nhu-Min and I, in developing this webinar, we really found that there was a danger in using the term competent. This term can suggest that there's a point where we all can become competent by developing certain skills or attending a specific number of training sessions. And as I previously mentioned, there's just no way. A lot of the issues that we're talking about are very complex. So we like to use the term cultural considerations. When we use this term, we can better give ourselves room to grow, have this lifelong learning process of self-assessment and development of critical thinking.
And with that cultural consideration aspect, for us, we try to take it a step further in being culturally responsive. That is more of the action that us as service provider are providing to the community, is to be responsive of their culture. You've heard about cultural sensitivity. There's a lot of words out there, but that responsiveness is an actual action that we as service provider are doing. You can be culturally sensitive, you can be culturally informed. Yes, you know about, to be patient and to, respect other culture. But how are you responding to an individual in front of you with something, with a culture that's completely different from what you've ever heard of or you've never even heard of before? So how do you respond to that? And that is an action that we as service provider needs to take a step towards, is to be culturally responsive and respond appropriately to the different individuals who are coming to seek services. With that, the opposite of being responsive is being reactionary. And that's where that bias comes in, is that where is your bias or prejudice for you to react a certain way, hearing information that you didn't know would prompted that certain reaction. So again, to be responsive to culture is to really understand where you stand as a service provider, where your values and where your bias and prejudice are.
Yeah, and with that being said, we came up with 8 different principles when developing cultural considerations, and this is on an individual level and definitely has to be on an organizational and institutional level. So the first principle that we found important when developing cultural consideration is understanding that all cultures contain a continuum of inconsistencies. On one end of the continuum, there may be an acceptance of violence. And then on the other end, there may exist a long-standing tradition that opposes violence against women and children. The second principle is individuals who experience violence come from different communities. They have varying values and norms. They are unique individuals, and their responses to the violence that they experience will be impacted by a variety of different influences. The third principle we want to consider, considerations have to be developed at both the individual level and the institutional level. Those of us that work for a nonprofit or a bigger organization, we can encourage our leaders to develop cultural considerations in the work that our organization does. The fourth principle is that training and learning cannot only occur once. Our own agency, as I previously stated, used to just provide mental health services to individuals who are from Southeast Asia. As things shift and change, the world change, needs change, then we develop with that and we learn new tools and new techniques to work with different populations.
And so with the training comes to also understanding that there are always going to be other agencies that are seeing different waves of needs that may not be addressed yet. And oftentimes, unless you are having that intentional dialogue with other agencies and other partners and service providers, you may actually miss that. And I feel like being a service provider ourselves, we try not to recreate the wheel. We try to see what the best practices are out there. And so being open to seeing what is out there and what are we missing for our own community to enhance it and make it better.
So moving forward in the principles, the fifth principle that we have come up with is that it's essential to work against institutional differences that negatively impact underserved communities, especially those inconsistencies that deny equal access to a range of services needed by survivors. With that principle, one of the things that comes to mind to me is language access. There are a lot of institutions and systems that we all work with and in that may not put the need for an interpreter or a translator at the forefront. So in developing cultural considerations, on an individual level, we can always choose to advocate on the behalf of our client or survivor. The sixth principle is self-awareness, okay? Being aware of what impacts one's decisions, the cultural biases, your own cultural biases, and your own worldviews. Consideration and competency requires willingness for the individual to adapt and alter their attitude as they acquire more information. So that goes back to that lifelong learning. The seventh principle is working collectively. It was one of the things that Nhu-Min mentioned earlier, is if you're not able to provide that service or be as culturally sensitive or responsive, to always reach out to another agency and do your best, again, to advocate on behalf of your survivor or your client to get the most meaningful access to care. And the eighth principle that we have come up with is that culture cannot be used as an excuse for violence. Working predominantly with the immigrant and refugee community, we see a lot of people say, well, that's part of their culture, right? In their culture, husbands hit their wives, or in their culture, sex assault is permitted. The reality, at least in our work and in our experiences, there's no culture that actually permits any of those things. That's where we as service providers have to do our own research, do our own learning, and most importantly, be aware of our own biases, our own prejudices, and also our own, understanding that we also might have gotten some cultural misinformation. So the goal of developing cultural consideration is to reduce the influence of culture misinformation, to examine generalizations, to be aware of our own thought processes, and for me, in my personal opinion, is to reach beyond your comfort level and put yourself in a place where you might be uncomfortable, but you're doing your best to advocate for your survivor or your client.
So with this, a lot of the principle that Zonya brought up comes up with that institutional aspect, which I'm not sure what role you guys are in your agency to where you can make actual changes. Are you in the management role or leadership role, or are you one of the direct service provider, case manager? But institutional change can seem very overwhelming, and it can seem like you're going up against a wall or a mountain, or however you like to see it. But the fact of the matter is, it does start with that individual, and that individual is you. You ask the person, where do you value culture? Where do you see yourself in your biases? And from there, having that open dialogue with maybe your leadership team or management team, having dialogue with your policy team, and how that could change eventually could change the agency as a whole, and where you guys are approaching everything. I think starting with evaluating that self-awareness of you as the individual can slowly make some movement towards changing the institution. And we're just talking institutionally right now, with your organization, but it can be bigger collectively too. And if we all just take that moment to realize that there are certain inequities that are occurring in various and different communities, why is that affecting your community, and how can you change your community where you're at? And that's an ongoing conversation. It's not something that can be discussed within a day. It's not something that can be solved with, changing certain laws, because to be realistic, there are always going to be new people that are coming in, and they're going to be experiencing something that we as service provider may not be aware of until one of us are able to find and see that trend. And so starting with you as the individual to see what is happening and being really mindful and honest with it. We know that we try to be culturally, considerate and culturally responsive, but we know we look at around in the population that we're serving, and we see there are actual population missing within who are not coming to the agency, and we ask ourselves why. Why are they not here? Even though we say we are inclusive, even though we say we have multiple languages, people of different culture. Why are these communities still not coming to our agency? And those are a reflective question within our own agency to really dive into and to see what we're lacking in.
Okay. So with that being said, we will be moving forward to our third topic of the webinar today, and that's to be more aware of the challenges that immigrant and refugee survivors of crime face. So in providing services to individuals from different ethnic backgrounds, we have to realize that even though individuals may be new to the US, they experience the same emotional reaction as all who experience victimization. This can include things like fear, shame, hope for change. In addition, immigrant and refugee survivors may find that seeking assistance from social and legal systems overwhelming and complex due to their lack of information and knowledge of how the system operates.
And with that, we also want to say that sometimes a lot of our refugee and immigrant survivors don't seek help because that's not the worst thing that's happened to them. They've experienced worse in their home country or in the refugee camp, that it's not an issue where they have to seek help, that they just have to get over it and live on with their lives. So there's also almost that cry of the experience of their trauma that they've gone through, that it's not to a point where they need to seek help.
And that was a great segue, Nhu-Min, because what we're going to be discussing now is when providing services to individuals from different ethnic backgrounds, we have to realize that there are certain barriers to even reporting or asking for help that come into play. When we're working with domestic violence survivors or sexual assault survivors, we see the financial dependency. And that is true in our experience across the board. That is not only true for immigrant or refugee survivors, it's true for a lot of our survivors. And this could be a financial dependency to the perpetrator or a financial dependency because the crime or the assault occurred at work and they have the fear of reporting because they might lose that financial assistance. The second thing we see very often in immigrant and refugee survivors is pressure to keep family together and also just general pressure from the family. We see a lot of, when it comes to sexual assault, where it may be a familial sexual assault, maybe from an uncle, a father, or a religious leader, and a lot of the survivors' family members is telling them that they shouldn't report it. This is not what we do in our community. So that's very common as well. The next thing we see quite often, and this is to piggyback a little off what Nhu-Min was saying, is that optimism, both on the fact that it probably won't happen again, this was a one-off, but also on the sense of this is definitely not the worst thing that has ever happened to me. We have a lot of survivors feel pressured, maybe by a teacher or a law enforcement official that says, well, you have to report this. This is something that is illegal in the United States. But a lot of us survivors are saying, well, I just don't feel like this warrants a report or warrants me having to move forward with any action. The next thing that we see quite often, as we previously mentioned, is that shame and stigma. Of, again, freeing from the family or just the shame of asking for help at all. We have to understand that with the population we work with, these individuals are incredibly strong, they've endured so much in their life. They uprooted their life to come to the United States, whether by choice or not. That to ask for help, whether it's to fill out, let's say, a crime victim compensation paperwork, is quite shameful.
So with that shame and stigma, though, we've also noticed that some of our clients really don't want to be a bother, that they have now moved to another country and they don't want to be bothersome. So asking for help means that you're being bothersome to someone else. And so that's a shame to you too, that why can't you figure this out? And so we have to oftentimes explain, like, no, this is my job. Like, I am here as a service provider to help you. But we always do get the, no, I don't want to bother. Like, no, it's not a big deal. And it's, it's too much for you. And so that's that's often the conversation that we really have to sit down and discuss and really talk with them, that this is not something, you know, that we don't do and that we are wanting to help. But again, that conversation takes time. It's not something you can have within an hour and have the client agree to get services. It just takes time in building that trust.
The next barrier or complexity or uniqueness in providing services to individuals from different backgrounds is lack of English. I know to a lot of individuals that might seem like a no-brainer. However, it is one of the biggest barriers we hear from our clients on accessing services. Okay, so more, like Nhu-Min mentioned, more time is likely needed to provide the correct information, resources, and support from an advocate or a service provider, because when you're speaking through an interpreter, your appointments are probably going to be twice as long. That's just the nature of how working with an interpreter goes. But even before they get to us, the report might have never been made because they were never offered interpretation to start with. Or there was interpretation at the scene, but the letters they're getting, whether it's from their school, from law enforcement, is all in English. And no one has taken the time to translate those documents for them or provide an interpreter to read them aloud for the survivor. The next one is also what might seem like a no-brainer to a lot of you is immigration concerns. With the current climate and the current rhetoric, a lot of our survivors don't feel comfortable coming forward, even if local law enforcement will not ask about immigration status. They're worried that somewhere, somehow, someone's going to find out their immigration status. We have individuals we work with that have been in the US longer than I have, over 20 years, and will still ask, and they're American citizens, and will still ask, will I be deported if I file for crime victim compensation? If the government has to give me any kind of money at all, will I be deported? And this fear is real for all victims of crime, not just DV or SA. So we're seeing robbery victims not want to come forward or not want to press charges or ask for restitution because of their immigration concerns, which I think dovetails well into the distrust of the system. Yes, the current rhetoric that's out there right now, we also know that word gets out quickly in a community. Some is true, some is false, and that can be very dangerous. But also a lot of individuals come from a background or a country that law enforcement, army, police are the bad guys. So it can be difficult for people to then say, oh, now I'm in this country, the person in the uniform is now a good guy. It's the person I go to if something bad happens. They're not the one perpetuating the crime on me. So that's definitely a uniqueness we see with working with our survivors. And the next one here is fear and discomfort when seeking help. I think that really encompasses everything we talked about, right? From the discomfort of just asking for help to the fear of deportation, fear of losing their children, losing their job, all the other things we've already discussed. With that being said, we're going to move forward to the last objective that we're going to be discussing today. There's a couple fun videos, so hold on. We're going to be talking and exploring language justice, but we're going to start really just on the language access piece, making sure language services are accessible to our clients and our survivors. So I will be showing a video. However, the video will look like it's buffering, but the voice should be perfect. So definitely just listen to the video. You'll see some pictures, but we'll discuss a little bit more what the video was trying to convey.
Borders. We've got different ideas of accepted and familiar. Here's what's accepted and familiar to me when I queue. I was raised in the UK. We are the world champions of queuing, waiting in line. And you know, aren't we? We're fantastic, yeah? You know, if you're waiting in line in a supermarket in the UK, so let's say there are 10 people waiting in line. And we're all getting a bit impatient, you know, because we're all waiting in line. And then they open a new cash register. Do you know what will happen in the UK? The first 4 people, they won't move, they'll stay in the queue. The next 6 people will move to the next cash register in more or less the same order. And they kind of check with each other. And if they open another cash register, the same will happen. It's like a formation dance. It's fantastic, eh? Would the same happen in Norway? No. What would happen if they shout out in Norwegian, it's ledig kasse, which is available cash register? What happens? Everybody goes for it. It's first come, first served. Isn't that what's accepted and familiar? Now, the first time that happened to me, I was shocked. And I said some not very nice things about Norwegians. But, you know, you've got to dig a bit deeper to find out, why do Norwegians do that? Why are they running for that cash register? Why is it a free-for-all and first come served? I think it's got to do with this. What? They say, this is the King of Norway on a train in 1973, that guy in the cap on the right. This is equality. And I think the queuing system in Norway is all about equality. First come, first served is about equality. And it's the ability to dig under the surface and find out what the underlying values are. That's how you know how to communicate with people. And this thing with equality is really important in Norway. It's the reason we're so laid back with each other. We don't bother with titles. We dress casually. It makes a fantastic business environment, actually, doesn't it? But sometimes this can take you a little bit by surprise. And in those situations where you feel uncomfortable or irritated, we have a tendency to jump to the negative conclusions rather than the positive conclusions, you know? And I mean, I travel all over the world. And I know you're not supposed to, and this isn't an advertisement for the airlines, but it's Scandinavian Airlines, and it's Lufthansa, and it's Singapore Airlines. And everybody knows that Singapore Airlines has the best service. Why? Because they have a whole lot more hierarchy in their societies. And therefore, when they serve you, they serve you. And Singapore Airlines staff, I don't know if you've ever been on a Singapore Airlines flight, but you just from the moment they welcome you, they look like they're going to serve you, don't they? I mean, it's just the body language. It's like anything for you, sir. Now, if a Scandinavian Airlines person did this when you came on, yeah, exactly, you would get suspicious, wouldn't you? What's going on? Because it's not accepted or familiar. That's it, you know? This is what it's all about. So this is how we...
Okay. So, again, I do apologize for the video in that, but I hope everyone could hear him pretty well. So what he was really talking about is cross-cultural communication. The phrase describes the ability to successfully form, foster, and improve relationships with members of a culture that's different from our own. It's based on a knowledge of many factors, such as other cultures' values, perceptions, manners, social structure, decision-making practices, all the things we discussed when we looked at the iceberg. So in the video, he talks about queuing, standing in line. And later in the video, there are pictures of how people stand in line in other countries. So that comes from that deep culture in the iceberg, right? How people stand in line, how close they are to each other. He shows a picture of a line in France that instead of it's a straight line, it's a curved line. A line in Finland where there's about 6 feet between each person standing in line. Or a line in India where everyone is very, very crammed in right next to each other. So those are things we want to consider when working with individuals from different cultures. Their ideas of manners, their ideas of standing in line, or of cleanliness, things like that.
And with that, I mean, oftentimes, especially in the Western American culture, we talk about body language. We talk about, you know, how awkward it is to probably have a phone intake where you can't really gauge how the person's feeling. So always having an in-person intake is much better. Similar to how we would read body language when it's someone who doesn't speak English as their first language. Because when we discuss about body language, though you may not know body language from their culture versus yours, you can see discomfort. You can see not wanting to answer a certain question. And that's where body language can be utilized for us to really understand each other, but it's also a space for us to realize, do I know what they're trying to say? Because like he brought up, with Singaporean, it's if you kind of bend forward, that's showing that you're willing to serve. And it's actually a very universal Eastern body language. That's a sense and a way of showing respect. It's when you kind of lower yourself. And there was actually a clip in Fresh Off the Boat where they were competing on who was respecting each other more. So they just kept bowing to like who was the lowest to show like, no, I respect you more. And so that, you know, that was a joke on the fact that that's how we know to show respect. But in other culture, you may not know what that means or how that would look. And so again, kind of being mindful of culture being different, body language helps us read people, but is that the universal language?
Yeah, and you know, when communicating with survivors, as Nhu-Min mentioned, whose first language is not English, we can, gestures obviously can be very helpful, or pictures, drawings, other nonverbal methods. At the bathroom at our center, because we have over, I would say 30 languages spoken at our center, we only use infographics. So, you know, a picture of a diaper and a red line through it next to the toilet to show that diapers don't go in the toilet, right? Because it would be impossible for us to have, say, please don't throw diapers in the toilet in 35 languages, because tomorrow we might have somebody that walk into our center that speaks the 36th language. In cross-cultural communication, we have to understand that others rely on different means to reach a common goal. Understanding basics required in engagement, like greetings or physical contact. In a lot of Asian cultures, touching is very appropriate, and then in others, touching is not. Or you only touch somebody that you really respect. I'm 27 years old and I still hold my mom's hand when I cross the road, because that's what my mom wants. My brother is 35 and still does the same thing, because in our culture, we'll always hold hands. In Middle Eastern cultures, a lot of men hold hands when they walk, and that's a sign of just respect and trust with one another, versus in the US, you may not see men holding, men who are friends holding hands walking downtown. Understanding that individuals may observe different holidays, but most importantly, even different hours of operation. In the US, where we're pretty strict, kind of, I would say that 7 a.m. to 6 p.m., you're okay to call somebody then or visit their office, versus in other cultures, they might be doing business at different times and different days of the week. And of course, if a language barrier ever presents itself, definitely it's in everyone's best interest to employ a reliable and experienced translator or interpreter. And we'll definitely touch on that a little bit later. So one of the images I want to bring back on the screen here is that cultural iceberg. So again, typically we look at things on the tip of the iceberg, but then we tend to get trapped in generalization about culture. Just to reiterate, it's very necessary to be open and to hear about individuals' experiences, beliefs, and values. And it's also important sometimes to suspend or at least be aware of our own biases and prejudices.
And bringing up what Zonya had brought up regarding touching and holding hands, similar to my Vietnamese culture, holding hands is fine. But then when you come in a hug, that's just awkward. And so there's that fine line, versus in a lot of American Western culture, hugging is showing closeness, and it's fine and it's normal. And people always say, I'm a hugger, so they'll come and hug you. But that may not be something that another culture such as mine would feel comfortable with, you know? And so, but how would you know that if you do not take the chance to really understand and dive into that deeper layer of the value of that individual?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so as promised, we are going to talk about language justice, but we definitely want to be aware that some organizations or systems do not have in place a language access plan or a way to get to that justice piece. So today we're really just going to talk about the accessibility of interpreters and translators. Interpreters are an important resource when providing support to individuals whose first language is not English. And this also, we talk about American Sign Language as well. So if someone's first language or their comfortable language is not spoken English, an interpreter should always be utilized. Access to appropriate interpreter will help in clearly understanding a person's needs and then facilitate access to other services. And then of course, at times there will be a need of a translator with any documents, especially if you're at systems or school, or even as a therapist, for example, you might have paperwork that you need to sign for somebody to start services with you. Usually, in my experience, that has been in English, and Spanish is starting to become more accessible, but maybe thinking about the community that you serve and translating some of those documents into some of those major languages.
We've had agencies say that, oh, this community doesn't come into our agency, so we don't need that language available, or somebody who speaks another language never comes here. Everyone who comes here speaks English. And we would challenge that by really asking the agency to look at the actual community. Who do you say you serve? And from there, look at the demographic. The demographic will show, and just, it may not be as accurate, but it'll show that there are numbers of other people who may reside within the area that you are serving that are not coming to your agency, and there's a reason for that. So the best way to allow an agency or your agency to be more accessible is being mindful of, okay, we say we serve community A through Z. In there, those communities speak these language. Maybe it's okay for us to have some materials available in these languages. They may or may not come in, but making that step as the agency to be more proactive in being part of the community allows them to see that, oh, I can come to you, or you do know that I exist in this community. And that in itself makes you in some way more reputable, and for people in the community to trust you to come and get help, that they don't have that fear. And so that's something that I always, want to bring back to management and leadership of like, oh, we don't see anyone who, everyone who comes in speaks English, but why is that? And then with that, also with management side and leadership side is, do you have a budget line for translator, for interpreter, and why not? Again, is it because the community you serve only speak English, or is it you just never look deeper into that community? Every agency has a place. For us, it's statewide. We know that we're not doing great outreach with rural communities, but we want to make that attempt, and that's where our collaboration with other rural agencies to understand the needs and the gap and how we can support it. And so, again, we are very self-reflective in what we are doing that needs to be improved. And so I'm just challenging you guys as individual working with certain population to really see who are you really wanting to help in the community in that sense.
Wonderful. So we're going to do just a quick, description of what a translator is and what an interpreter is. So a translator refers to written materials being translated from one language to another. If you request a translator to come to court with your client, don't expect them to make a noise, because they're only going to be writing from one language to another. An interpreter is the oral transferring of information from one language to another. We use with our interpreters what's called consecutive verbatim interpretation, and that means I speak, I pause, interpreter speaks, pause, and then we wait to hear what the client has to say. Sometimes it's broken up. We do it phrase by phrase. This goes back to one of the first things I mentioned is sometimes you're meeting with a person whose first language is not English, maybe double the time. We also want to understand that the interpreter's role is not a cultural advisor, not an assistant, not a confidant. It is not appropriate to ask an interpreter about their opinion on matters that are being discussed. Interpreters should always be trained in the specific protocols and policies on, around accountability, confidentiality, privilege, those kinds of things. And we are working really hard as an agency to train interpreters on victim services. Interpreters can get certification to interpret in hospital or clinic settings, and they can also be get certifications to interpret in mental health settings. But there recently has been a big push to get certification in the victim assistance setting. Okay, it is necessary to have an interpreter when, first and foremost, if your client is requesting one. That's a no-brainer. If you think it would be better for the process, or if you feel like there's a problem being understood. With all that being said, our agency, we say, while it's the client's decision, we always offer interpretation and translation. We do not want to speak for the client if they would need one or not. I, very early on in this career, sometimes would think, well, I can't really understand the client, so I'm going to get an interpreter. And the reality is, if the client does not feel comfortable with an interpreter being there, or they feel like they can effectively communicate with you without one, then that's the respect we need to provide for our clients and survivors. With that being said as well, clients and survivors sometimes don't want an interpreter because they have a fear that this person might be part of their community, or just sharing their dirty laundry, and we'll touch base a little bit on that as well. Next, I'm going to show another video. I will just say that there is a curse word in there. If anyone is not okay with that, let us know now. We don't have to play the video. It's a clip from a movie called Babel, one of Brad Pitt's best performances. And let me pull that up. Okay, so I like that video in talking about interpretation for two different reasons. Well, two main reasons. The first one is, as you can see, the doctor told the interpreter, yeah, she's not well, she's gonna bleed to death if we don't take her to a hospital. The interpreter goes, she's fine. Probably in fear or in fear of hurting Brad Pitt's character, right? Because his wife may be dying. But also, for any of you who've watched the movie, this interpreter is a tour guide. He does not interpret or has no training interpreting in medical settings. So it was really difficult for him to have to tell Brad Pitt's character, hey, your wife's gonna need stitches or she's gonna bleed to death and die. So this brings me back to kind of what we were talking about. So when possible, obtain an interpreter that specializes in victim services. I was told this story that a Japanese survivor of sexual assault from her husband was telling her lawyer through an interpreter my husband forces me every night to have sex and I don't want that. The interpreter interpreted it as she doesn't want to have sex with her husband. Okay, as we all can hear, those are two very, very different meanings, especially when it's in a law setting where, you know, accuracy is very, very important. This goes for in law enforcement settings as well. But I would say in all settings, accuracy is very, very important. As I mentioned before, sometimes survivors don't want an interpreter because they fear that it's somebody from their community. So when possible, share the interpreter's name with the client before the meeting so they can maybe check if they feel comfortable with that person. Or I had a client who ended up that the interpreter was a leader in a religious leader in her community because the advocate didn't take the time to figure out who they were getting for an interpreter. And that also goes for gender preferences. Sometimes individuals want to work with same gender, sometimes it's on the opposite gender, but that would be on their comfort level. As always, please never use children, but more than that, don't use family members or relatives or even friends to interpret. Like I mentioned, we use consecutive verbatim interpretation. The key word there is verbatim. They are not paraphrasing what I'm saying to the client and vice versa. So most trained and licensed interpreters will also use verbatim, and it's very important. I've had an interpreter in the past where the client spoke for about a minute and the interpreter gave me a 2-word answer. And I had to say, can you please interpret everything she just said? And he said, well, you know, she was just saying the same thing over and over again. I said, that's okay. Can you please interpret the same thing over and over again?
And with when we're talking about obtaining an interpreter, you as an agency always has the right to ask the interpretation agency about, hey, I would like to request someone who's legal, who has legal knowledge. I would like to request someone with medical knowledge, or I would like someone who would know more about criminal justice, victim services. Obviously, like we were talking about, there has not been a push or certification for victim services, but we know when we talk about the criminal justice system, but not really, because we can say we want someone for legal, because when you hear legal, it could be immigration, it could be court, but legal can also mean criminal justice aspect of like someone who's a victim of crime. What does that look like? And doing that due diligence on your end of just asking and requesting with someone to have this type of terminology available there is important, because terminology for cultures vary. And interpreters have really hard jobs trying to really interpret accurate information when terminology like domestic violence, sex assault, does not exist in other culture. So being really mindful of getting someone who can be accurate in the way they interpret is very important to make that intake or to make that conversation successful. And typically, we haven't had that issue, but typically interpretation centers are good at letting you know, oh no, we don't have anyone available that would be that preference. Then you can kind of make that decision on your own. But asking that ahead of time, so you're not getting someone who has no idea what criminal justice means in their language, or no idea what probation is. And then, you know, then again, there's that disconnect, and it takes much longer to build that relationship and that rapport. So just be mindful of when you're making requests, it's okay to ask a little bit more. Just like, can I get the name of the interpreter ahead of time so that I can make sure my client doesn't know this person? Or can I have an interpreter who knows about trauma, or who may know about hospital stuff? And so that's not too much to ask.
Yeah, and that also goes back to being bilingual as well. So a lot of individuals, myself included, in Nhu-Min, we're bilingual. And sometimes we're called to interpret, whether it's for a coworker or even another agency. And we have to say, being bilingual does not mean you can be an interpreter. to do consecutive verbatim interpretation is actually really, really difficult. There's a lot of studying you need to do to be able to do it verbatim. I think a lot of us, when we are bilingual, we've interpreted for our friends and family, but we're usually paraphrasing. So that's the biggest difference. And also, I don't know, or I didn't know how to say probation in Thai. I never knew that, never had to learn that. I didn't even know how to say judge in Thai, because in my life and my family, we never used that word. We were not involved in the legal justice system. So I would not consider myself an interpreter. I do consider myself bilingual, but when my clients have to go to court or meet with a lawyer, I will always request a certified interpreter.
And of course, with certified interpreters or translators, there is money associated to it. And that's why kind of cutting the cost and having a family member or having a bilingual staff member do it really diminish the meaningfulness that you want, the relationship that you want with your client. And so it comes back to, what is your leadership or management looking at when it comes to budgeting to hire interpreters and translators? Have they considered that? How much are they willing to pay for that? And knowing that a lot of these services are not cheap. It does cost quite a bit. And me being the director, I've always been mindful of how much money am I willing to slate out for interpretation translation. And I always rather over budget that than under budget it, because we don't know who's coming in. We don't know who's gonna, be our next client. So we have to be mindful of, again, the community that we serve in this constant change. And that would be something I always ask managers and directors on, how are they, optimizing their funding, and are they being inclusive about it?
Yeah, and also being aware too that language of lesser diffusion, so languages that are not spoken as much, can also cost more money. When I try to translate documents, my Spanish document costs about $50, and my Amharic or Somali documents will cost about $100. Just because less people living in the United States speaks that language. So that goes back to that budget line. And I know I brought up the word language justice. So what we're talking about today is a wonderful step towards language justice. But as Nhu-Min mentioned, definitely go back to the leaders in your organization, or if you are a leader in your organization, in your next grant request, really try your hardest to have these budget lines for interpretation and translation, for cultural responsive trainings for your staff, time where you and your staff can just get together and ask questions of one another of, maybe difficulties that y'all might be having. So back to the learning objectives that were for today. So we started by very little trying to understand that culture needs to be understood in its complexities. But with that sentence, we know that it's a lifelong learning. The next thing we touched on was the importance of being aware of our own biases and prejudices, right? We, a lot of times, like I hear people say, right, like, oh, I'm colorblind. And there's a great line that Trevor Noah says when people say I'm colorblind is, well, what do you do at a stoplight? Okay. We're not asking individuals to be colorblind or like, I love all, heal the world kind of thing. It's just being aware of our own biases and our own prejudice, our own upbringing, our own community that we live in. I live 30 minutes away from where we work. The community I live in is very different than the community I work in, and being aware of those things. The third thing we discussed was just being more aware of the challenges that our immigrant and refugee clients may face. Some of those different barriers or uniqueness that occurs when providing services or individuals asking for services. And the last thing, of course, that we touched on was understanding and exploring the idea of language justice and language accessibility. We have about 20 minutes left on the call. We did leave that on purpose just for questions. So if anybody has any questions, comments, concerns, go ahead and type them in and we'll try to address them as the group. We will be sharing our contact info as well. So you're welcome to reach out to each of us individually. If you have questions for Nhu-Min on, hey, how do I write a grant that asks for interpretation and translation? I know she'll be more than happy to answer those questions. If you want a similar training to be brought to your agency or your organization, please reach out to us. We can do more webinars, but as Nhu-Min said, we love in person, and we also can go statewide. So please reach out to us for that as well. So again, if anybody has any questions, comments, concerns, I'll give a couple minutes if anyone wants to type that in.
Yeah, while people are typing that in, I'd be curious if you all could share, I know we talked a little bit about like the sounds and the smells, like say maybe at a shelter or at the outreach center, at the center where folks are looking at. What are some of the things that you all consider at your office or when you're looking to place someone for a shelter?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, to address the question on what do we consider in our, like, what are the sounds and smells in our center? So our center is quite unique. We have over 50 staff members, as I said, speaking about 30 different languages. So we really embrace everyone there. Everyone brings food to share, so it really smells like everyone's grandma's kitchen, if that makes sense. But simple things as we have brochures translated into a lot of different languages. We have art from different parts of the world. And we definitely make our center feel like somebody is home. They don't have to worry about their kids running around and breaking a vase or anything like that. We want individuals to feel as comfortable as possible. The second part of your question, Maria, was on when placing individuals in shelter. So we do that all the time. So actually the crime, quote unquote, that we see the most in our center is domestic violence. We assist people in going into shelter all the time. So we ask the clients kind of what are they needing to make sure they feel comfortable going into that shelter. The first thing is food. Nhu-Min actually had a client a while back that wasn't eating at the shelter because everything was macaroni, cheese, things like that. So Nhu-Min had to go out and went shopping with the client, took her to the Asian market, got her rice, got her, Asian meats and seasonings and things like that. So we definitely start with what the client is needing, and then we go from there. But then also asking clients, as we talked about, there's a lot of shame and guilt in asking for help. They might just say, I'm okay, I'm fine. But then maybe asking, what would you like to eat when you're at the shelter, right? Sometimes I get whatever they have is fine, and of course I respect that. But other times it's, well, in my house, we eat this, and I fear that the shelter won't have that.
So Anna Maria, I'm looking at your question right now. That's a great question because I feel like, especially when I'm in the position of director, I see this happen a lot. And it is very frustrating. And I can only imagine how staff feels. Specifically.
Really quick, Nhu-Min. Really quick, sorry. So the rest of the participants can't see the question. Would you be able to read it for them, please?
Okay, great. Good to know. How do you deal with issues of leadership maybe paying lip service to wanting to do cross-cultural work, but not really making any active efforts or actions to that goal? And I have a feeling other people may see this within their own agency. How to deal with this issue in a professional sense, starting that dialogue. And it could be you as an individual or you as a community provider or a community member to actually bring it up. I feel like it starts with that conversation and giving that feedback of, hey, didn't we say at the beginning of the year that we're gonna do some sort of training or we're gonna do some sort of outreach? What is that looking like? Where are we on that planning process? And I know, and I feel like some of the answer will be, oh, we haven't had time, or there's no budget for that, or no one's volunteering because there's a lot of work to be done. I feel like part of that, if that were to be an answer, it would fall to you as the individual who is who is identifying that as a problem to make that active step. I know for my agency, I work under an ED who's very, who really respects our work as director, as well as allow us that anonymity to see a problem, fix it the way you feel is appropriate and fits with the value of the agency and the mission of the agency. And if your leadership believes that, okay, if you just take this over and we'll go ahead and get started with it, go ahead. You can do that outreach yourself. You can go and reach out to agencies similar to us who is part of the community, or other smaller nonprofit agency that is in the community, to begin that relationship building in that work. I feel like when it comes to leadership and paying that lip service, it comes back to money. We don't have the money or the time for it, but we want to, we would like to, and we think it's important, but who's gonna do it? And I'm not saying you as a staff member should take on, wear more hats and take on more job duties, but is that important to you? Is that a part of what you want to grow for the agency itself? So it falls back on that end. And I think for us, it's very important to go ahead and strive for what may not be funded, and seeing how that builds the relationship, and then maybe from there get that money that we wanted or that you wanted for that cross-cultural work, and that there's actually emphasis for it.
Yeah, and just to add to that too, Anna Marie Martinez, if your agency or organization is receiving even a penny of federal dollars, even if it's not for your program, but if your agency is receiving that, you do fall under the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and part of that is meaningful language access. So like, put that in Google and definitely learn a little bit more about that. And that's a great, if you feel comfortable, right, great challenge maybe to the leadership in your organization of like, hey, I know we receive federal funds to do some programming, are we following it? Right? Or are we following that meaningful language access, or that Title VI part of that federal funding? Yeah. And Diana Cortez, YouTube links, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Maria, we can send that to either the group or when the recording goes up, we can have both of those YouTube links up with that as well.
Yeah. So that'll actually be in the follow-up email that you receive. There will be a link to our YouTube channel, and that should be posted either by the end of the day today or tomorrow. So you all will have access to that through that link that'll come through the email.
Okay. Awesome. Any other questions, comments, concerns for us? I just put up our contact information. So it's mine and Nhu-Min's work phone and our direct email. So please reach out to us anytime for any reason at all, and we'll try our best. And back to that collaboration piece, we are a statewide agency providing services to victims of all crime. So if you're feeling that you need some extra assistance in that, please let us know, especially on that language piece. We would like to think that we can be a really good partner. Okay, so we've got a question from Leanna, and it says, some agencies don't have the capacity or personnel to help clients navigate the process of getting into shelter or accessing other services. Are there agencies, including APDC, that may be able to help? Yeah, awesome. So definitely, as I just said, I think you pressed send on that question right when I was saying the collaboration piece. So APDC, obviously, we are biased. We do think we're trying to do the best work we possibly can, but please reach out to us. Us being a statewide agency, we do have connections with a lot of other agencies across the state of Colorado. So if you ever feel like you need resources with that kind of stuff, please don't hesitate. When it comes to direct client service, we're also not stingy with services. So even if an individual is your client, we will absolutely do whatever we can to support that client in accessing in their meaningful access to care and services. Okay, any other questions or comments?
Great, thank you both so much. Is there, just in case other folks have other questions and are typing those in, is there anything else while they do that that you would like folks to know or to leave with before wrapping up the webinar today?
I think, you know, we've touched on all the things that we wanted to leave people with. I think more than anything, two things for me is that lifelong learning. I never assume that somebody from Asia or even Thailand, which is my country of origin, has similar experiences to me. So it's that listening, lifelong learning, digging into that 90% of the iceberg. And then the second thing for me is that collaboration piece is huge. So again, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, even if it's not to work with us, but to just get other services around the state of Colorado. We're more than willing to help and make those connections.
And to tie in with what Zonya brought up, I think for me, it's that self-awareness. Though you may not have that leadership position or management position, I think it starts as you as an individual to be self-aware of the work environment you're in, the community that you're serving, and where you want to take that to provide that meaningful services. And does it start with having that dialogue with the management? What does that look like? And who would be able to support you? I can help with that, just in case you were wondering. And so I'm more than happy to really talk about how staff as well as leaders of service providers to really understand that there's always going to be gaps in services and there's always going to be need to improve. But what does that look like and how can we help each other? And where can we really look at funding to support all this? Because it comes back to, when do we have the time? Who has the money? Who is really going to do the research into that? And so being mindful of that too.
Okay, so a question from Diana Cortez is, just for clarification, when the advocate feels the need to use an interpreter, but the client does not want it, is it your advice to leave it to the client's decision? My general answer to that is yes, because we work on client-centered self-determination. If understanding one another does become an issue, and I've had to do this in the past, where I just have to say at the end, I'm having a really difficult time understanding, would you feel comfortable with an interpreter? Maybe asking that one more time, or maybe a translator, right? Like maybe what I'd have to do was get whatever I was gonna ask them, all translated, send it in an email, and they send it back. And then we work that way, because really sometimes it comes from that fear. They really don't want anyone in their community to know what's going on. I hope that clarifies it a little bit.
With that clarification, there are times where we've had clients indicate that they understand English well enough and they don't need an interpreter. But we've, kind of gone around it and saying, tomorrow we'll be talking about more legal aspect of your case, or we're going to be addressing other immigration stuff that will have, more difficult terminology, and having an interpreter would help us for everyone to be on the same page. And most of the time our clients are comfortable when we actually tell them what is the purpose of the interpreter too. Because if it's just a normal conversation, they will say, well, we're having a conversation fine just now. Why do we need an interpreter? But really diving into the reason behind it and the complexity of immigration, of legal stuff, of medical stuff, that it's good to have an interpreter to help for everyone to be on the same page.
Well, wonderful. Thank you both so much for this wonderful information and for spending this time with us. I hope that folks got as much out of it as I did, and please do feel free to reach out to them I will be sending their emails, their contact information, and the follow-up email as well. So if you haven't gotten the opportunity to grab those emails, don't worry, those will be in the follow-up email as well. So again, thank you so much for presenting. Thank you all for being here. Any questions that you might have that didn't come up or that you didn't think of, feel free to reach out to Nhu-Min and to Zonya, and they can answer those questions. Any logistical issues that you might have had, if you have any questions for CICASA, for me, you can always send me an email. Look out for that email here in the next 30 minutes to an hour with that information that I promised. We do have some upcoming webinars that we hope you'll be able to join us on. We do have one tomorrow. It's one of our final PRIA series webinars on facilitating support groups for incarcerated survivors. A couple of advocates from Sava Center in Greeley will be doing that tomorrow at noon. It'll be an hour and a half. And then our next webinar after that is in July. And it's a part 2 with the address confidentiality program with an in-depth dive at safety planning. So that'll be with Project Safeguard and Address Confidentiality Program, July 31st at noon. We hope you can make it to both or either one of those. Please do remember to fill out the survey that I'll be sending here shortly on SurveyMonkey. Again, it's very, very helpful for us just to know that we're on track with the types of topics that you're wanting to get and that you're needing. So again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for attending the webinar. And one last time, thank you to our presenters.